The night air over North Vietnam was thick with humidity and tension on November 21, 1970. Inside the belly of a United States Air Force helicopter, heavily armed men sat in silence. They were members of an elite task force flying low to avoid enemy radar detection. Their destination was a small compound located just 23 miles west of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. This was the Son Tay prison camp, where intelligence reports indicated that dozens of American prisoners of war were being held in deplorable conditions. The men on the helicopter knew that they were flying into one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the history of warfare. One mistake or one unlucky mechanical failure could result in disaster for the entire team. The stakes for this mission could not have been higher for the United States military or the government. Hundreds of American pilots and aircrew had been shot down over North Vietnam since the conflict began years earlier. Reports trickling out of the secretive communist nation described torture, starvation, and medical neglect. The families of these missing men were desperate for news, and the American public was growing increasingly restless about the fate of their sons. A successful rescue would not only save lives, but would also deliver a massive psychological blow to the North Vietnamese leadership. However, a failed mission would hand the enemy a propaganda victory and likely result in the death or capture of America's finest special operations soldiers. Leading the ground element of this audacious raid was Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons. He was a legend within the Special Forces community, known for his gruff demeanor and immense physical strength. Simons had spent his career preparing for moments exactly like this one, having served in World War II in Korea before taking on this assignment. He was a man who led from the front and demanded absolute perfection from his subordinates. Beside him in the planning stages was Brigadier General Liberate J. Manor, who commanded the overall task force. Together they had handpicked the raiders from hundreds of volunteers and subjected them to months of rigorous training. Simons sat near the door of the lead helicopter, staring into the darkness, ready to unleash hell. As the helicopters raced toward the objective, a critical question hung over the entire operation. Was the intelligence accurate enough to justify the immense risk involved in this deep penetration raid? The Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence bodies had used high-altitude reconnaissance drones and satellite imagery to build a picture of the camp. They had identified guard towers, secondary fences, and even the drying of clothes in the courtyard. Yet there was always a margin of error when relying on photographs taken from miles above the earth. The raiders wondered if the prisoners were truly there, or if they were walking into a lethal trap set by the North Vietnamese army. The answer would only be found once boots hit the ground. Suddenly, the lead helicopter carrying the assault team flared for a landing directly inside the small prison courtyard. The plan called for a controlled crash landing to maximize the speed of deployment. The rotors sheared through the trees with a deafening roar as the heavy machine slammed onto the earth. Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons and his men poured out of the wreckage with weapons raised. Simultaneously, other helicopters landed outside the walls to secure the perimeter and neutralize the guard towers. The night erupted in a chaotic symphony of automatic weapons fire and explosions. The raiders moved with practiced efficiency, clearing buildings and shouting through bullhorns for the American prisoners to get down on the floor for safety. However, amidst the smoke and the adrenaline, a shocking realization began to dawn on the assault team. The first group of raiders, led by Captain Richard Meadows, breached the main cell block, expecting to find gaunt and weary Americans. Instead, they found empty rooms and bare cots. Meadows and his men swept through every corner of the compound, checking every dark recess. The sinking feeling in their stomachs grew heavier with each empty room they cleared. The intelligence had been technically correct about the location, but tragically outdated regarding the timeline. The prisoners of war had been moved to another facility weeks earlier due to seasonal flooding from a nearby river. The camp was effectively a ghost town. Despite the absence of prisoners, the raiders had to complete their mission and extract safely. Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons had inadvertently landed at a secondary school complex nearby due to a navigation error, but he turned the mistake into a tactical advantage. His group engaged a large force of enemy soldiers at the school, preventing them from reinforcing the prison camp. Within minutes, Simons realized the error and called for his helicopter to lift him to the correct location. The discipline of the American forces was absolute. They neutralized the enemy threat, inflicted heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese guards, and reassembled for extraction without losing a single man to enemy fire. The entire ground operation took less than 30 minutes. The helicopter fleet roared back into the sky, leaving the burning compound behind them. The ride back to Thailand was somber as the adrenaline faded and the reality of the empty cells set in. They had executed a flawless tactical raid, arguably one of the most complex in military history, but they were coming home empty-handed. There would be no joyous reunions on the tarmac and no liberated men walking down the ramp. The raiders felt a deep sense of professional frustration mixed with personal sorrow for the men they had failed to bring home. They knew the news would be devastating to the families waiting back in the United States. When the news of the raid broke, it sent shockwaves around the world. Critics in the media and politics were quick to label the mission a massive intelligence failure. Hearings were held and questions were asked about how the military could launch such a massive operation without knowing the prisoners had been moved. However, for the prisoners of war still held in North Vietnam, the raid had a very different meaning. When news trickled into the prisons that American forces had actually landed outside Hanoi, morale soared. The prisoners realized that their country had not forgotten them. The North Vietnamese, terrified of another raid, consolidated all prisoners into a central Hanoi prison where they could support one another. The legacy of the Son Tay raid remains a complex tapestry of tactical brilliance and strategic disappointment. It revolutionized the way the United States military conducted joint special operations, paving the way for the formation of permanent units like Delta Force and the Special Operations Command. It proved that American forces could strike anywhere at any time, regardless of enemy defenses. While they did not bring anyone home that night, the raiders of Son Tay changed the conditions of captivity for hundreds of men. They forced the enemy to treat the prisoners better and gave hope to those in the darkest of cells. It stands as a testament to the warrior ethos that no one is left behind. To understand the full gravity of the Son Tay raid, one must look back at the years leading up to 1970. The air war over North Vietnam had been grinding on with relentless intensity. American aircraft, specifically the F-105 Thunderchief and the F-4 Phantom, were flying daily sorties against heavily defended targets. The North Vietnamese had established a sophisticated air defense network supplied by the Soviet Union. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery claimed a heavy toll. Every time a plane went down, the pilot faced a terrifying descent into hostile territory. Villagers and militia were often the first to reach the downed airmen, subjecting them to immediate violence before handing them over to the military. Once in custody, these American pilots were transported to prisons in and around Hanoi. The most infamous of these was Hoa Lo Prison, known sarcastically as the Hanoi Hilton. Here, the men were subjected to systematic torture intended to break their will and force them to sign confessions of war crimes. They were kept in solitary confinement for months or even years. Malnutrition was rampant and medical care was non-existent. The North Vietnamese government refused to acknowledge them as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, instead labeling them as air pirates. This classification was used to justify the harsh treatment and the refusal to allow inspection by the International Red Cross. By 1970, the plight of these men had become a major political issue in the United States. The families of the missing men had organized and were pressuring the administration of President Richard Nixon to take action. Intelligence agencies began an intensive effort to locate the prisoners. They analyzed thousands of aerial photographs looking for specific signs of American habitation. In May of 1970, a new source of intelligence emerged. A high-altitude SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft captured grainy images of a compound near the Son Tay Citadel. Analysts noticed a peculiar arrangement of rocks in the courtyard that appeared to form a letter K, a code for "come get us." This potential signal electrified the intelligence community. The location was isolated enough to make a raid theoretically possible, but close enough to Hanoi to make it incredibly dangerous. The Pentagon established a secret planning group known as the Polar Circle to study the feasibility of a rescue. They determined that a helicopter assault was the only viable option. A ground march would be detected instantly, and a parachute drop would scatter the force too widely. The mission required precision timing and the ability to land directly on the target. The plan was briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who gave the green light to proceed with detailed preparation. Brigadier General Leroy J. Manor of the United States Air Force was chosen to command the task force. He needed a ground commander who could train a disparate group of soldiers into a cohesive unit. He chose Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons. Simons was a veteran of the Office of Strategic Services and had extensive experience in unconventional warfare. He was given the authority to select his men from the elite Special Forces groups at Fort Bragg. Simons looked for maturity and combat experience. He did not want hot-headed youths, he wanted seasoned professionals who could keep their cool under extreme pressure. Over 100 men were selected and moved to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. At Eglin Air Force Base, the training began in total secrecy. The task force was given the code name Ivory Coast. The men were told they were training for a mission of national importance, but were not given the specifics. A full-scale replica of the Son Tay prison compound was constructed at a remote auxiliary field. To avoid detection by Soviet spy satellites, the mock-up was built on a framework that could be dismantled during the day. Every night the structures were assembled and the men practiced their assault. They rehearsed every movement until they could clear the compound blindfolded. They practiced breaching walls, neutralizing guards, and carrying wounded comrades. The air element of the task force was equally crucial. The pilots were selected from the Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service. They flew the HH-53 Super Jolly Green giant helicopters, which were heavily armored and capable of aerial refueling. They practiced low-level night flying using terrain following radar. This was a dangerous art form, requiring the pilots to fly just feet above the tree line at high speeds. The margin for error was zero. One slip would send the helicopter crashing into the Florida pine forests. They also practiced formation, flying ensuring that the assault force would arrive at the target simultaneously. One of the most innovative aspects of the plan involved the landing at the prison itself. The courtyard was too small for the large HH-53 helicopters to land. The planners decided to use a smaller HH-3 helicopter for the initial assault team. However, the courtyard was filled with trees that would block the landing. The solution was drastic. The HH-3 would intentionally crash land into the courtyard, shearing off the trees with its rotor blades. This suicide landing would deliver Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons and his assault team directly into the center of the action. The pilots of this late helicopter knew they would not be flying it out. As November approached, the task force was deemed ready. They were deployed to Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. The cover story was that they were a rescue unit conducting routine training. The men were confined to a secure compound to prevent any leaks. The tension was palpable. They spent their days checking and rechecking their weapons and gear. They studied maps and scale models of the prison until they had memorized every brick. The weather over North Vietnam was the final variable. A typhoon was approaching the region, which threatened to ground the helicopters. However, forecasters predicted a small window of clear weather on the night of November 21st. General Manor made the decision to launch. The men were briefed on the true target just hours before takeoff. When Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons announced they were going to rescue American prisoners of war near Hanoi, a cheer went up from the assembled soldiers. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. They loaded onto the helicopters as the sun set over Thailand. The flight path would take them over the mountains of Laos and into the heart of enemy territory. Aerial refueling was conducted in complete radio silence, a feat of airmanship that required nerves of steel. To distract the North Vietnamese air defenses, the United States Navy launched a massive diversionary raid. Carrier-based aircraft dropped flares and flew mock attack profiles near the port city of Haiphong. This caused the enemy radar operators to focus their attention to the east, leaving the western approach open for the helicopter force. The deception worked perfectly. The North Vietnamese Air Defense Command was thrown into confusion, believing a major bombing campaign was underway. Meanwhile, the quiet helicopters slipped through the gaps in the radar coverage, flying low through the valleys. The assault force was divided into 3 groups. The first group, codenamed Blue Boy, was the assault team that would crash land inside the prison. The second group, codenamed Greenleaf, was the command group led by Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons. They were to land outside the south wall to blow a hole in the perimeter and support the assault. The third group, codenamed Redwine, was to secure the road leading to the prison and prevent any enemy reinforcements from approaching. Each man knew his role and the role of the man next to him. They carried specific weapons for their tasks, including CAR-15 carbines, M79, grenade launchers, and demolition charges. As the helicopters approached the target area, a navigational error occurred. The terrain looked identical in the moonlight, and the helicopter carrying Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons landed at a secondary school 400 meters south of the prison. This location, known as the secondary school, was actually being used as a barracks for enemy soldiers. Simons and his men leaped off the helicopter and immediately came under fire. They were outnumbered, but their ferocity and training overwhelmed the enemy. They moved through the complex, engaging targets and neutralizing the threat. It was a fierce firefight that lasted only minutes. Simons quickly realized he was at the wrong location. He remained calm and radioed for his helicopter to return and pick them up. The pilot displayed incredible skill, landing amidst the burning buildings to retrieve the Greenleaf element. Within minutes, they were airborne again and heading for the actual prison. This mistake turned out to be a stroke of luck. The enemy soldiers at the secondary school would have been the first to reinforce the prison. By engaging them early, Simons had effectively eliminated the immediate reaction force. The road to the prison was now clear. Meanwhile, at the prison compound, the Blue Boy element had executed their crash landing perfectly. The trees were chopped down as planned, and the helicopter came to a rest in the center of the courtyard. Captain Meadows and his men sprinted toward the cell blocks. They used bolt cutters and chainsaws to breach the doors. They shouted their rehearsed lines in English, telling the prisoners to stay low. They expected to see emaciated men rising from their bunks. Instead, they were met with silence. They kicked open door after door, finding only dust and cobwebs. The realization hit them hard. While Meadows searched the cells, the Redwine group was securing the perimeter. They laid down a curtain of fire to suppress the guard towers. The North Vietnamese guards who were present were taken completely by surprise. Many were cut down before they could reach their weapons. The volume of fire from the American raiders was overwhelming. The AC-130 gunships circling overhead provided additional fire support, destroying bridges and blocking roads to prevent enemy movement. The coordination between the ground and air elements was seamless. When Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons arrived at the correct compound, his men joined the perimeter defense. They blasted a hole in the wall to allow for an easier exit. Simons linked up with Meadows, who delivered the crushing news that the camp was empty. There was no time to dwell on the failure. They had to extract before the entire North Vietnamese army descended on their position. Simons gave the order to withdraw. The raiders moved to the extraction zone, counting their men to ensure everyone was accounted for. They boarded the waiting helicopters, which were taking scattered small arms fire. The flight out of North Vietnam was tense. The element of surprise was gone, and the enemy air defenses were fully alert. Surface-to-air missiles were launched into the night sky, seeking the heat of the helicopter engines. The pilots flew evasive maneuvers, dumping chaff and flares to confuse the guidance systems. It was a white-knuckle ride back to the safety of logs. When they finally crossed the border, the tension in the cabins began to ease. They had been on the ground for 29 minutes. They had killed dozens of enemy soldiers and destroyed a prison camp without suffering a single fatality. Back at the base in Thailand, the mood was somber. The raiders were exhausted and disappointed. They had risked everything and had nothing to show for it. General Manner commended them for their performance, emphasizing that the tactical execution had been perfect. The intelligence failure was not their fault. They had done exactly what they were trained to do. The men were debriefed extensively to understand exactly what had happened. It was later revealed that the prisoners had been moved in July, almost 4 months before the raid. The intelligence failure was attributed to a compartmentalization of information. Different agencies had different pieces of the puzzle, but failed to put them together in time. The drying clothes and the activity seen in the photos were likely from the guards and maintenance crews who remained at the camp. The message formed by the rocks was likely an old signal that had not been cleared. It was a bitter lesson in the limitations of technical intelligence. No amount of satellite imagery could replace a human source on the ground. Despite the immediate sense of failure, the raid had profound strategic effects. The North Vietnamese were stunned that American troops could land so close to their capital with impunity. It shattered their sense of security. In response, they closed the outlying prison camps and moved all the American prisoners to the Hoa Lo prison in downtown Hanoi. This unintended consequence was a blessing for the prisoners. For the first time in years, many of them were no longer in solitary confinement. They were placed in large communal cells where they could talk, organize, and support each other. The morale of the prisoners skyrocketed when they heard about the raid. The news was whispered from cell to cell. They knew that their country was willing to risk war to bring them home. It gave them the strength to endure the remaining years of their captivity. The treatment of the prisoners also improved slightly. The North Vietnamese realized that the Americans were valuable bargaining chips and that dead prisoners were of no use. The food improved and the torture became less frequent. The raid had undoubtedly saved lives, even if it did not rescue anyone that night. The Son Tay raid also had a lasting impact on the United States military. It highlighted the need for a permanent, dedicated special operations force. The ad hoc nature of the task force was successful because of the quality of the men, but the military leadership realized that they could not always rely on assembling a team from scratch. This realization led directly to the creation of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, commonly known as Delta Force later in the decade. The lessons learned at Son Tay regarding joint operations, night fighting, and helicopter assaults are still taught in military academies today. Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons became a national hero. His leadership and courage were recognized with the Distinguished Service Cross. He remained a symbol of the Special Forces community, representing the quiet professional who gets the job done. The raiders themselves formed a tight-knit bond that lasted for the rest of their lives. They gathered annually to remember the mission and the brotherhood they shared. They were proud of what they had attempted, even if the outcome was not what they had hoped. The raid also exposed the deep divide in American society regarding the Vietnam War. Supporters of the war saw it as a heroic example of American commitment, while opponents saw it as another example of military incompetence and waste. However, few could question the bravery of the men who flew into the heart of darkness to save their brothers. The raid transcended the politics of the war and spoke to a more fundamental human value, the duty to protect one another. It remains a shining example of the lengths to which soldiers will go for their comrades. In the years that followed, the returned prisoners of war often spoke of the raid with reverence. They credited it with saving their sanity. When they were finally released in 1973 during Operation Homecoming, they thanked the raiders personally. The bond between the rescuers and the prisoners was unique. There were two groups of men connected by a single event that changed all of their lives. The empty cells at Son Tay were not a symbol of failure, but a symbol of a promise kept. Today, the Son Tay raid is studied not just for its military tactics, but for its moral clarity. In a war defined by ambiguity and shifting political goals, the mission was simple and noble. It was a rescue mission, pure and simple. There was no territory to conquer and no enemy to defeat other than the captors. The objective was human life. This purity of purpose is what sets the raid apart from the rest of the conflict. It is remembered as a moment when the United States military demonstrated its highest ideals. The legacy of the raid lives on in every special operations mission conducted today. The equipment has changed and the technology has advanced, but the core principles remain the same. Surprise, speed, and violence of action are the hallmarks of the modern operator. The men of the Son Tay Task Force were the pioneers of this method. They wrote the book on modern hostage rescue. Every time a Special Forces team launches a mission to recover a hostage, they are walking in the footsteps of Bull Simons and his men. As we look back on the raid half a century later, it serves as a reminder of the cost of freedom. The men who flew into North Vietnam were volunteers who knew the risks. They went because they believed in their duty. The empty camp at Son Tay stands as a monument to the fog of war, but also to the unyielding spirit of the American soldier. It is a story of courage that will be whispered for generations to come, reminding us that even in failure there can be triumph. The raid on Son Tay was a daring attempt that defied the odds. It proved that barriers can be breached, and that distance is no obstacle to determination. While the helicopters returned empty, the spirit of the mission filled the hearts of those left behind. It was a message sent in fire and steel that no American is ever truly forgotten. And in the end, that message may have been more powerful than any physical rescue could have ever been.